Hello everyone, and thank you for coming back to yet another episode of The Gloving Paradigm. I am your host, Peter, aka LPD8 Dubuque, and this week's going to be a very interesting week because a lot of this subject matter is going to be very subjective in its own nature, as you can probably tell by the title. That this week is going to be about abstract concepts, and the reason why I'm talking about this concept, or this subject matter really, is because recently I've been seeing a lot of people posting onto the Glover's Lounge, the Art of Gloving, and also on Reddit about just concepts that people have difficulty learning over their time span, which is totally understandable because I had my own fair share of, concepts that were just giant obstacles for me to overcome, and eventually over time I actually overcame them. So I actually kind of want to talk about, abstract concepts and gloving and trying to obtain these abstract concepts. Now, what would I consider not abstract, or as I like to call concrete concepts, or very simple basic concepts like, finger rolls is a good example of one, just because if you just talk to somebody about what finger rolls are, it's very simple and concrete in its own nature. It's literally just opening and closing fingers independently in a motion that looks like a wave. Very concrete in its nature, right? Then you also have things like stacking, which is very concrete and simple in its nature. You're literally just stacking your hands on top of each other and you're moving them in a formation that keeps them in a stacked formation. So, those are your concrete styles of concepts, if that makes any sense. Tutting in a sense is also concrete, but I'm not going to get into that because there are elements of the abstract that people have to take into consideration when it comes to things like tutting, but I'll get into that a little bit later. So what do I actually consider to be an abstract concept? Well, it's not something that you can sit there and definitively draw on a piece of paper and have somebody actually understand it in that sense. A good example that I always like to use is something like musicality, where musicality, yes, you can study music theory and have a good basic understanding of music as it is to help facilitate musicality. However, I feel like when it comes all the way down to it, it's basically a concept that you have to feel rather than somebody to tell you to do this at this point of the song and do this at this point of the song, and this is the concepts you should be using at this point of the song kind of deal, which in my opinion doesn't necessarily work because you have this level of subjectivity to it that you have to work on, right? So I feel like with musicality, you have to really feel musicality in order for it to be executed properly. There's no right formula to a song in terms of what you need to be doing, because with musicality, it's supposed to help facilitate your expression of the music, as well as it being coherent of your expression to the piece of music that you're using. So it's not necessarily something that you can sit down, tell somebody that this is how it's supposed to be done, because it's based off your feeling, right? And you can probably even go as further as saying something like showmanship is also in that same vein, because as I was putting it, showmanship needs to be that creative flair that you express of yourself that allows the audience to really feel what you are feeling. That's another abstract concept. Another idea when it comes to abstract concepts is kind of like having to use your brain to do abstract actions. Like if you look at the grid as a concept, right? And this is a very classic example of something that a lot of people have difficulty understanding and actually mastering. On paper, literally just saying that the grid is this imaginary grid that's in front of you, that's in between you and your viewer, and you have to make a point on that grid, and you can move that point to any point of the grid, or you can move through that point on the grid. So telling your person that's giving the light show that they need to visualize this grid is something into the abstract as I see it. Okay, and the main reason why I think in that nature being abstract is because you're training your brain to do something that it doesn't normally have to do in real life. Your brain doesn't have to naturally make grid points around itself in order to understand the reality around itself, right? So the other thing that I always like to talk about when it comes to the grid or grid work is not only do you have to help visualize the grid for yourself, but you also have to convey the grid and its parameters to your viewer, right? If you think about it, you know, moving through a point is basically a way of showing the parameters of your grid, you know, whether it be, you know, up, down, forward, and back, or you actually turn it on to a 45-degree angle, which I'll get into a little bit. But you do have to convey your parameters to your viewer as well, so they can also visualize what you're visualizing. And that's another very abstract concept in my opinion, because, you know, you're telling your viewer how they need to be perceiving things, yet they're going to perceive things in their own way, regardless of how well you do it, because that's just how subjectivity works. You know, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, basically. So what is the big obstacle in mastering these abstract concepts is pretty much a learning curve. And I will even admit that gloving on its own has a pretty steep learning curve, because, you know, you get into the basics of like stacking, finger roll, you know, basic tutting, things of that nature, where it's very, very simple. And then you get into the more technical stuff in tutting and flails and whips and things like that, where there's actually kind of a science to it based on a consensus of the community, really. But, you know, there's this huge difficulty in learning and even teaching these concepts, because it's one of the things you kind of have to discover on your own in a way. Like, people can the best way to put it is like, people can show you the door, it's you that has to go through it. It's you that your brain has to really break through this little discovery door type deal, right? So, you know, there's that huge difficulty in even teaching it, in my opinion, that makes it, in turn, makes it really hard to learn. You know, and also having this, you know, the comprehension of the concept itself is just a challenge in and on its own, in my opinion. You know, for me, a concept that was really hard for me to understand was tutting. Just basic tutting was such a huge challenge for me, because I just couldn't comprehend the whole idea of it, you know. So, you know, coming to like looking at tracing, I find tracing to have abstract elements to it, even though it's a concrete concept, in a matter of my opinion, really. You know, so taking an example of tutting, what's the abstract element to it is, well, when it comes to like tracing, you have to visualize literally making these lines and showing, you know, these points of where things turn and where they can pivot and things of that nature. You know, that's a little bit abstract, because you have to visualize it. You have to visualize, you know, the lines that you're creating, basically. You know, if you're thinking in the sense of like playing the game of Snake, and you're creating the lines that the character you're playing is following, you know, those are things that, you know, people have a hard time comprehending, because if you think about it, where did you ever have to use something like that in your life before? So that it's a foreign concept to you that you have to really get your brain to wrap itself around. So, you know, and then there's just certain concepts to me that are just ineffable. Now, if you don't know what ineffable means, it's the inability to describe what it is, basically. You know, like, again, when it comes to musicality, is, you know, a way to describe it is just you feeling the music and your emotions replicating the expressions of the song, you know. But, you know, how does one comprehend that? It's, you know, there's a level of difficulty, so you have to put yourself in situations where you are putting your brain to work in that capacity, if that makes any sense. You know, so the ways that a lot of people that I've talked to and really work on trying to really learn and master these concepts is, one is basically trial and error. You know, it's one of the things that just over time you have to learn. And, you know, these are the certain concepts I feel like take the longest to learn, because there's a level of, I don't know, philosophy that you have to take into account, or, you know, just a level of different theories that are outside of the gloving capacity that you have to draw from to bring in to help facilitate that, you know. So trial and error is always going to be a surefire way of doing it, you know, levels of practicing and using your muscle memory to get to these points where you're not actually necessarily having to think about it, where it's just more of an impulse type deal. Again, that's to me a level of abstract. You're training your brain to understand these concepts, and not only your brain but your muscles as well to facilitate these concepts. You know, so as much as everyone will just go onto the surface level of thinking just practice, and burning it into your muscle memory, yes, while that is good, that's not the only way that you can do it. You know, there's unconventional ways that I've, you know, have learned over my years of teaching people. You know, one way that I like to call it is puppet mimicking. And what's puppet mimicking is literally, the best way I can describe it is like the scene from Ghost with the pottery scene, or, you know, how golfers teach other golfers how to golf by literally standing behind them and controlling their hands and their motions to, you know, literally help you feel how it's supposed to feel when you do it. And that's kind of like what I like to do when I was teaching like my younger brother and my other close friend when we had our team together. And once a week, that's how I would, you know, help them learn new concepts that they were trying to learn from me, is I literally would hold their hands and literally control their hands to the point where they actually made sense to them. And, you know, very shortly after, they actually understood what I was trying to teach them, and that's how they learn. You know, so if you're learning from somebody in person, this is always a good method that I've always done that's, you know, always had decent results. It doesn't work for everybody, but it is something that you can always try. It's, you know, having your brain learn new things in different ways that it hasn't learned before. You might unlock something that your brain just couldn't have a train of thought of before, and now you're training your brain to learn in these new ways of thought. You know, another great unconventional way that I know a lot of people are probably going to tell me that I'm stupid for saying this, but taking a break from just gloving in general for a little bit actually helps. You know, for me, taking a break is just simply, you know, just walking away from it and working on something else for a little while. You know, whether it be like, you know, whatever it is for you. Like drawing for me is a good way to kind of distract myself from it. Creative writing is another good way to distract myself from it. You know, even doing simple daily chores is actually a good method way to not only work on something else that isn't what you're trying to focus on, but it allows you to actually free up, you know, mental capacity to actually think about concepts like that. You know, if you guys ever watched The Big Bang Theory, there's actually this phenomenon has been touched on in an episode where Sheldon is trying to understand how particles move through a graphene sheet, and he works at the Cheesecake Factory, and he talks about how he figured out how to solve something by scraping cheese off of a plate. You know, these mindless, repetitive tasks that your brain doesn't need to use its full capacity to do, which allows your creative aspects of your brain to actually focus on other things. And I am a proud believer of this because I did it when I was 15 and I was working as a dishwasher at a pizzeria. You know, now granted, I wasn't gloving when I was 15 because gloving wasn't around when I was 15 yet, but I was able to focus on other things that I wanted to focus on, whether it just be like, you know, story creation with my friends, because, you know, me and my friends been wanting to make a video game for so long that, you know, it will allow me to sit there and work on like, how would I want to start the story out and things of that nature. You know, this is something that you can actually use to help you figure things out or stumble upon ideas for gloving. And, you know, especially if you're working in a situation like that, or like for me with my new job working at Goodwill, being a donation attendant, my brain doesn't need a whole lot of mental capacity to process the donations that I'm getting and putting them in the right categories that they need to be in. You know, I can do that with my eyes closed because I've done this style of job for over 3 years, so I know how this works. And my brain just knows how to do it so well into muscle memory that allows me to actually kind of let my brain drift off and think about other things that I can work on. And I will even tell you that I do that now with with my episodes, just so I can think of ideas of what to bring for you guys. Because sometimes, and I will even admit to anyone who wants to try to be a content creator for gloving, it can get really difficult thinking about ideas for episodes. So, you know, as you guys probably remember from the very beginning of this episode, is that I was reading a lot of posts and comments about, you know, concepts that are difficult for people to learn and what, you know, their thoughts are, and it made me start thinking about this. So, you know, just things of that nature where you want to think about. So, you know, working on a different task will also just help. You know, taking a break from it, you know, it's kind of like that whole idea where you were thinking of something, but then you instantly forgot it, and you're having a difficult time thinking of what you forgot. So somebody starts to distract you by asking you irrelevant questions, so you're not focusing on what you were trying to remember, and then suddenly you remember what you were thinking about earlier, and it all just comes back. That's the idea, you know, where you take a break and you distract yourself from what you've been working on that's frustrating you, and then all of a sudden you kind of have this aha moment where everything just makes sense, you know, and then you go back to it and you do it and you realize how easy it was, or you feel like how easy it was, but it was just so hard for your brain to wrap around it, you know, things like that. Those are the things that have worked for me when it comes to learning and mastering these abstract concepts. Now, I actually asked around a lot of people, and one consensus that I noticed that a lot of people have is that, you know, not following the grid, or moves and concepts that don't follow the grid per se, is considered abstract, which I kind of find odd because it's just kind of weird. Like, I had one person who was saying that impacting is an abstract concept, and I asked them if they can expound upon it. Well, the response that I got didn't necessarily answer my questions per se, as he was saying it's more just 100% your creativity, which that's not the question I was asking. I was asking what makes impacting an abstract concept. Is it, you know, the ideas of how you're supposed to sequence your light changes, or, you know, just the general idea of how you're supposed to do things? Never really got an answer on that, but I can see where the whole light sequence changing thought process can be a little bit abstract, you know. And I think some people just didn't really understand the questions I was asking in terms of what is abstract in terms of gloving. Because I had somebody just tell me that freestyling is their form of abstract, and it's, you know, using the fundamentals to create abstract concepts. It's like, well, that didn't really answer my question, you know, in terms of what do you consider an abstract concept. Now, I will even tell you this right now. I do not consider freestyling an abstract concept because that doesn't make sense to me. You know, abstract concepts is that you don't use conventional ways of thinking to create these. Like, a good example, in a recent interview that Puppet did with Merck on the Gloving Nucleus, he talks about how he kind of creates concepts for himself, and he tries to draw from everyday things. A good example that he liked to use was like aquatic creatures, you know, jellyfish, turtles, fish, whales, what have you, and thinking about the motions that they make to move around. You know, you have jellyfish that do the whole little swish thing where they kind of pop up and then they drift down a bit and push themselves, you know, further and further. And he talks about how to incorporate a movement like that into your gloving. That's, to me, is abstract thinking, because you're drawing from outside elements to create something. And that's, you know, that you can probably say that might be concrete. However, I don't think necessarily, because how you're thinking about it makes it abstract, in my opinion. Okay, especially when it comes to like certain speeds and certain, you know, movements in terms of tech. You know, what are you drawing off of? Are you drawing off of like how a crane lifts material or things of that nature? So it all depends on how you guys actually look at it, right? And I actually liked how Puppet explains it, that he looks at like everyday animals that you see, you know, all the time, and thinking about how their motions can be incorporated into your movements in terms of gloving is a really interesting abstract way of thinking. So that's the idea I'm trying to convey is with my listeners, is, thinking in terms of the abstract and how to obtain these abstract concepts. And, instead of feeling like the only way you're going to learn it is somebody telling you or showing you, when certain concepts you can't be shown. You can't write it down on a piece of paper and expect the person to be able to replicate what you're putting down, especially something like musicality or showmanship. Or you can even take flow, maybe even possibly tech to that extent, because, if you understand, like, my definition of flow is that your movements and your concepts have to align themselves in a way that the audience feels like they're literally being carried through the performance instead of having to follow the performance, if that makes sense. It's kind of like, certain levels of text that are out there. You have some that you're reading right through it and you literally feel the words carrying you through the piece, as opposed to you literally following and trying to draw the conclusions itself. That's what flow is to me, is that your entire performance is literally carrying the audience, where the audience doesn't feel like they have to work to understand, that they are literally just being engulfed by the performance and carried through the performance. And another great example that I was talking about with another person was transitions. Transitions is, in my opinion, a very abstract concept, because it's not necessarily, this definitive way of how you can transition from one concept of move to another. Hybriding these two concepts together to make that transition. Like, look at liquid to tutting or vice versa. What did we create to make a great transition to either or? We came up with wave tutting. It's a combination of both liquid and tutting at the same time that allows us as performers to move in and out of each concept. And the guy that I was talking to was talking about how, like, clusters are, which, if you think at the first point, that's, like, I like to say, surface level thinking, that you just do like 6 points and you separate them into groups of 3, and then you separate them into normals, or you can even do 3 groups of 2 and then you separate them again, and then you move them around to make that, which, again, the whole idea of visualizing these lines that you have to move through and move around can definitely throw a lot of people off. So, transitions is a great example of something that can be, it's rather abstract in its own nature, because, combining 2 different forms to make a new form to transition from one to the other, it's very abstract, because it's not like, oh, you think, like, surface level thinking, like you're doing finger rolls, and then once you put all your fingers out and lay them flat, then you can stack them and move into tutting that way. That's one example. But then when you incorporate things like wave tutting into doing things to start doing liquid, then it kind of flows a lot better, because you're not necessarily seeing this drastic shift from, like, tutting into liquid, or liquid into tutting, or tutting into whips randomly, or king tutting into flails. There has to be some kind of hybridization to help ease the viewer into the next set of concepts, really, right? So that's where everything kind of gets really, really muddled. And in my opinion, it's one of the things that just is going to take time for you to just get there. So my final thoughts and final tips on this whole subject matter is that, at first, if you don't succeed, try again. And, a classic mantra that I'm sure most of my listeners know, and I'm probably tired of hearing it, is blunt force trauma and repetition gets it right every time. This is a little mantra that I've heard from a drill sergeant when I was in basic training for the Army. And it's one of those things that just stuck with me. And it's something I've always talked about when it comes to gloving in general, is that a lot of the times it's just blunt force trauma and repetition gets it right every time. It's one of those things that you just have to commit to and really push yourself to. If you're somebody who has, like, difficulty with musicality, like, my advice is literally just, listen to the music that you like listening to, and kind of devoid yourself of any distractions from it, where you can literally just focus in on the music as hard as you can to the point where is essentially kind of transports you to a place that nothing else is around, and allows you to fully envelop yourself into the piece of music. You know, it's weird to try to describe this, because this is, again, one of those abstract things for me, that once I actually hit that point in my mind, you know, I don't feel anything else but the music. You know, I'm so ingrained into the music now that I'm literally just evoking what I'm feeling from the music. And that's something that's hard for people to understand. It's hard for people to grasp this idea of concept, but it's just one of those, it's kind of one of those things that you have to just work hard to achieve, because once you actually get to that point and feel it, you know how it feels now, and that's the point where you need to get to. So, you know, I can talk all day about stuff like this, but I want to leave it to you guys to ask me the questions that you guys would actually like to ask me, because, you know, I find abstract concepts and gloving to be a very interesting topic, and I can probably spend hours upon hours on end just talking about these concepts to you guys. So that's what I want to hear from you guys, is what questions would you have for me about abstract concepts, or even telling me what you think is an abstract concept. I would love to hear what you guys have to say about abstract concepts and what you consider to be abstract, because I feel like this is a discussion that doesn't really get hit on a lot, and I feel like us talking about it a little bit more would actually help open our minds to other ideas of how to approach things and things like that. And I definitely love having discussions like that all the time. So if you actually really would like to have a discussion with me, you can definitely hit me up at the Facebook page, which is aptly named The Gloving Paradigm. You can also hit me up at my email, which is muttonchopguy@gmail.com. And you can definitely also hit me up at my Discord server, which will be linked in this episode's description on Podcast Garden, which, if you guys haven't gone on to Podcast Garden, it is a fantastic RSS feed host. It allows you to put it up on iTunes, SoundCloud, all these other various sites. Definitely recommend, if you want to start a podcast, to try it there. It's about $40 a year just to host it up. If you are somebody who wants to do a weekly podcast like I am, you can do a free monthly podcast with them where it's no charge to you at all. It all depends on how you want to do it. But you can also just hit me up in my various places so we can actually have this discussion. I would love to hear what you guys think is abstract, and will ask you questions to help facilitate your thought process. So you have all those places that you can hit me up. Do not be afraid to hit me up and ask me even some ridiculous questions, because, like I always tell a lot of people, the dumbest question is the question that's never been asked. Okay, so don't ever be afraid to ask me questions. Don't even be afraid to just say a comment about anything about the show. You know, I would love to hear all of you guys' feedback. But other than that, that's pretty much all for my show for today. I'm very thankful for all the listeners and all the people who have interacted with me about this subject matter. I'm very, very glad that you guys have been trying to give me some of your input, because I love to get your guys' feel about these concepts and these subject matters. But that's all for me today. I am your host, Peter, aka LPD8 Dubuque, and I'll see you guys all next week.